Putin spoke to a group of BRICS leaders and religious leaders, and he told them that he condemns collective punishment. So, Chris, Russian President Vladimir Putin speaking with the president of South Africa.
We call for joint efforts of the international community aimed at de-escalating the situation, a ceasefire, and finding a political solution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And the BRICS states and countries of the region could play a key role in this work.
How significant is it that Vladimir Putin, on the cusp of a triumph in Ukraine, has weighed in on this at its hottest moments?
Well, we shouldn't be surprised. We've done everything in our power to transform Russia into an implacable enemy of the United States. We've poured buckets of filth and abuse all over Putin's head, condemned him as a criminal, described him in terms I wouldn't use for my mother-in-law. And
you won't go there.
The bottom line is that he's sending another signal, though, and he's right to do this. He's saying, look, this is not going to be contained. You're on a road to spreading this conflict because Putin is being in touch with Erdogan, Raisi, Nasrallah, Assad, the King of Jordan, General Sisi, all the principal figures in this drama. So he knows how serious this is. We're the ones that refuse to take this as seriously as it should be taken. And this is my concern about Israel. The Israelis aren't taking it seriously. They think they've got us and that we can stop anything. We can't stop anything. In other words, if this runs out of control, we are limited in what we can do. And the Israelis don't seem to understand that. The American people, I don't think, are even engaged. And so he's really speaking to Washington, and he's trying to say, look, this is very dangerous. And by the way, you can infer from this that he will stand behind Iran and potentially Turkey and the others in the region if they are drawn into the conflict with Israel and the United States.
Colonel, does stand behind mean PR statements or military stand behind?
I think it also involves military power, just as we are involved militarily with Israel. And I think we have to take that into consideration. It's not something that he's going to look for as an opportunity. Right. But he's not going to let Iran be destroyed by us. He's not going to stand by and allow Turkey to take a beating if they both end up in conflict with Israel.
I'm reading from the reporter from Al Jazeera who was in the room. In remarks that criticized the West, he, Putin, said certain unnamed forces were seeking to provoke further escalation and to draw as many other countries and peoples into the conflict as possible. Gee, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. I wonder who he was aiming that at.
Yeah, that's pretty obvious. And how many times have people pointed out who has been intervening all over the world repeatedly in the affairs of other countries?
Right.
And we are seen consequently in a very negative light. And the grievances people have against us go back to the 1950s. When you talk to Iranians, they'll take you through the whole chapter and verse of what's been going on there since the 50s regarding our interference in their internal affairs. Remember that both the the Chinese and the Russians have made it clear on repeated occasions that they will do business with people, they will cooperate with people, they will help and assist people. They will not intervene in the internal affairs of other countries.
Colonel, here's South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, who was more direct than President Putin and who spoke at the same conference right after President Putin did.
The collective punishment of Palestinian civilians through the unlawful use of force by Israel is a war crime. The deliberate denial of medicine, fuel, food, and water to the residents of Gaza is tantamount to genocide.
Is that the way, I know South Africa's not in the region, but is that the way regional leaders feel?
Oh, I think so. I don't think there's any question about it. He's simply echoing the sentiments of virtually all of the Arab states, the Iranians, the Turks, the states in North Africa, Central and South Africa. Everyone is watching this. The Chinese certainly are. And remember, these are people who've lived in countries where those things were denied from time to time for various reasons, wars or authoritarian governments. They know what that means. They know what famines do. They understand what mass deportations mean, mass expulsions. All of these people have been through these things. So unsurprisingly, they're very sympathetic to the Arab population in Gaza.
I want to go back to Turkey for a minute. A question from one of our viewers. Turkey's a member of NATO. What happens if Turkey gets in some kind of a conflagration with the IDF, whether it's over these boats or not?
You know, the whole NATO question probably deserves a lot more attention and a lengthier discussion than you're going to get it here. But I think we need to understand something. NATO is emerging from this operation in Ukraine with a lot of blood on its hands and a very serious black eye. You had Stoltenberg, who just a few months ago said, if we lose, in other words, we, NATO, are seen as losing in Ukraine, it could have ugly consequences for the future of the alliance. Well, I don't think the alliance, strictly speaking, has much future. If you are living in Eastern Europe right now or anywhere on the Russian periphery, and you truly believe that in the event of a conflict that might erupt on your borders, that the United States is going to send forces in a timely manner to rescue you in a war, you are probably delusional, because we can't. We can send something eventually, but not enough to make any difference quickly. And now we have Ukraine, where we built a force from the ground up over the period of 8 years. We equipped it better than most forces in the North Atlantic Treaty Alliance, and it lost. It didn't simply lose, it was utterly annihilated. The true scale of the defeat is not known in the West. Everyone's gone to great lengths to suppress the information to conceal the tragedy. The Ukrainian nation is destroyed. Now, I'm not saying that the Russians have any interest in Eastern Europe. I don't think they have any interest whatsoever in moving in that direction. I think they'd like to do business with everybody.
Right.
But we're busy insisting that you can't cooperate or work with us unless you have a government and a society that looks like us. Assuming that we look all that good, that's another matter.
Right.
That's our attitude. That's crazy.
Yeah.
You know, why have we cooperated over the years with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia if it didn't fit our notions of what is right and what is wrong? Well, whatever you want to say, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia has turned out to be a very stable society with a stable government.
Here's President Xi of China. Their translation is written, so I will read it aloud for the benefit of our friends and colleagues who are experiencing judging freedom audio only. The root cause of the Palestinian-Israeli situation is the fact that the right of the Palestinian people to statehood, their right to existence, and their right of return have long been ignored. I have emphasized on many occasions that the only viable way to break the cycle of Palestinian-Israeli conflict lies in the two-state solution, in the restoration of the legitimate national rights of Palestine, and in the establishment of an independent state of Palestine. There can be no sustainable peace and security in the Middle East without a just Palestine. China calls for early convening of an international peace conference. China calls for an early convening of an international peace conference that is more authoritative, to build international consensus for peace and work toward an early solution to the question of Palestine that is comprehensive, just, and sustainable. Are you surprised that he has weighed in directly like this and that he has said more clearly than anybody that the Palestinian people are entitled to an independent country with all the rights of sovereignty?
A retired general of the Israeli Defense Force several years ago said to me as I was driving with him along the Golan Heights, He said, you know, Douglas, we should have gone to Madagascar. Now, most of your audience will not understand what that means. But at the time when the Zionist movement was taking off, there were lots of discussions about where should we Jews go. And one of the destinations was Madagascar. There was absolutely no determination early on for any reason that it absolutely desperately needed to be in the Middle East and in Palestine, or what we call Palestine, certainly since the Roman Empire. His point was simple. You know, look, if we'd gone somewhere else, we probably would have been far happier and far more successful, because we were planted in a region where from the moment we arrived, we were treated as a bacillus, as an infection. Mr. Netanyahu has acknowledged this. He has said publicly, this is a civilizational conflict. He is correct. Israel is not, strictly speaking, a Middle Eastern state. It's an extension of the West. It is a Jewish form of Western civilization, but it is nevertheless an extension of it. It is not part of the Islamic world, and the Islamic world has never accepted it. So the problem I have with what Mr. Xi is saying, not with his ultimate purpose, but he needs to point out that from the moment they arrived, the Jews were unwanted. They were under assault. And so they seized what they have by force. And we, and to a lesser extent, the British, have helped them to stay there and flourish and survive. But 75 years later, the same condition that made them unwelcome is still there. It hasn't changed. But the quality and the capabilities of their adversaries or potential opponents, those things have improved dramatically. And they can no longer play off the various actors against each other, which they've done very successfully for many years. Now, the last point is this. Mr. Xi said something that's very important, and I absolutely agree with the president on this. President Xi said an authoritative conference. In other words, an outcome that can be imposed on the people in the region. That is the way that issues have been settled, certainly in Europe for centuries, and I would argue to some extent in Asia for centuries. In other words, we're not going to tolerate any more squabbling or conflict. This is how it's going to be. The great powers stepped up and imposed it.
But will there be an authoritative imposition of the state of Israel? Well, Bibi Netanyahu and the independent state of Palestine, well, Bibi Netanyahu was the prime minister of Israel.
No, but it also won't. No authoritative solution will be imposed as long as we are heavily engaged, because we are unambiguously on Israel's side. Right. And again, as I've said before, I support Israel as well. Unfortunately, I think at this stage, it should be pretty clear to everyone that the two-state solution is dead. I don't know why people keep bringing it up, because one of the things that Mr. Netanyahu set out to do was to destroy it. Remember, I pointed out that the danger here is that the Israelis have burned several bridges behind them. In other words, they crossed the Rubicon and they can't go back. They can't go back now.
Right. Well, you say it's dead. Then how significant is it that both Vladimir Putin and President Xi call for it on an international forum at the same day at the height of the war in Gaza?
Part of it is a certain amount, I think, of cynicism, because they know it is fundamentally unacceptable to the Israelis, and as a result, we probably won't support it. But they also feel that a great injustice has been inflicted on the Arabs in Palestine. Okay. And they are correct. The Arabs have suffered an injustice. This injustice is very old, go all the way back 75 years. There's no question about it. But that's not going to change. Because you now have a state in the region. And the key question is this. All right, Hamas, under what conditions can you live in peace with Israel? Answer that question. Then you turn to Mr. Netanyahu and say, Mr. Netanyahu, under what conditions can you and your government live peacefully with your neighbors, specifically the Muslim Arabs on the West Bank and those in Gaza? They've got to answer those questions. Until you've answered those questions honestly and openly, it's pointless to hold a conference.
Last subject, I'm checking my iPhone. I don't see anything new. on the explosion at the American-Canadian border. But you seemed very concerned about this when we emailed each other before we came on air. Do you know any more about it, Colonel?
No, but my concern stems from the following. Go back to 2001. When that tragedy in New York occurred, the very first action that was required was not to invade someone else's country. It was to close our borders, secure our ports and airports, and find out who was actually in the country. We didn't do that. What we did was talk about invading other people's countries, Afghanistan and ultimately Iraq. And that was a serious mistake. I don't know what will happen now, but I do remember sitting on an aircraft flying down to CENTCOM in January of 2002 and having a short, amicable, but nevertheless short argument with a passenger who kept saying, you know, this is Iraq. They're behind this. We need to get rid of these Muslims. We need to get rid of these Arabs. And I said, well, first of all, I don't know who was on the airplane, but it remains to be seen that Iraq or anybody else had anything to do with this. Haven't you ever heard of anything called Al-Qaeda? Of course, that went nowhere. And that was an advantage for the people in the Bush administration who wanted desperately to march into the Middle East. Well, we marched in, and it was a catastrophe. And we never needed to go in the great numbers that we did in Afghanistan. And everyone with experience in the region said, you could go in there with a large enough supply of gold and buy Osama and his friends from the locals because they're not Afghans, and ultimately they'll sell them to us. No one would listen to that. Everyone wanted the grandiose gesture of bombing and strafing and
shock and awe. Yes.